So, most of you by now have had to have noticed how the far right and the far left seem to appear ever more authoritarian. There's been a lot of theorizing around why this might be, but I think if we take a historical look, we might be able to delve into the real reason why the Nazis and the communists look so much alike. Throughout antiquity, there had been very little political philosophy, most laws coming from kingly decree, or in places like Athens, where you begin to see political philosophy through democratic vote. But these laws were often ad hoc, devoid of a consistent principle. They were proposals to deal with social problems, correct aberrant behavior, or satisfy the whims of those in power. What principles existed were largely extracted from ancient Greeks like Aristotle and medieval Christian thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle and Plato both wrote of what an ideal state may look like. Plato believed in the rule of the philosopher king, writing in Republic. Until philosophers or kings or princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy and political greatness and wisdom me in one, and those commoner natures who pursue either to the exclusion of the other are compelled to stand aside, cities will never have rest from their evils. What we see here is an aspiration towards a society run perfectly by an almost godlike, all-knowing figure. This lends itself to modern ideas of central planning and top-down control. Aristotle, on the other hand, wrote of what might be considered a bottom-up system, writing in politics. Property should be in a certain sense common, but, as a general rule, private. For when everyone has a distinct interest, men will not complain of one another, and they will make more progress, because everyone will be attending to his own business. From these two thinkers, we begin to see a dichotomy. On one side, Plato's perfect state, run by the perfect person. On the other side, Aristotle's more organic state, comprises the individual actions of the people themselves. As medieval Christianity rose, it sought to reconcile biblical truths with the classical truths, the Greek philosophies. It was Aquinas who expanded on the ideas of Aristotle while reflecting those ideas with biblical teaching. In doing so, he outlined the ideas of natural law. From this, he laid the foundation for a reasoned view of not only politics, but of human nature. The intention of every man acting according to virtue is to follow the rule of reason. Wherefore, the intention of all the virtues is directed to the same end, so that all the virtues are connected together in the right reason of things to be done. Here, Aquinas stressed the importance of the use of reason to discover the virtuous or correct action. The tension between Plato and Aristotle's vision, paired with an emphasis on reason to discover the proper action, planted seeds that would bear fruit centuries later. As the Enlightenment dawned, with it came a similar reverence for reason and logic. It was these philosophers that would apply the rigors of logic to the proper role of government. Philosophers, most notably John Locke, used Aristotle's views of nature and purpose paired with the natural law of Aquinas to create what was called liberalism, today known as classical liberalism. It was this codification of a political philosophy that created a stark difference from the feudal lords and monarchs of the day. Once again, Aristotle and Plato were arguing. From this comes the rise of the political spectrum. Leonard Read observes in neither left or right. The leftists were, for all practical purposes, ideologically similar to those of us who call ourselves libertarians. The rightists were ideological opposites, statists, interventionists, in short, authoritarians. Left and right in France during 1789-90 had a semantic handiness and a high degree of accuracy. Murray Rothbard corroborates this account in For a New Liberty, for just as the defenders of the Ancien regime took their place on the right side of the hall during the French Revolution, so the liberals and radicals sat on the left. From then on until the rise of socialism, the libertarian classical liberals were the left, even the extreme left, on the ideological spectrum. Though the position was an accident, the animosity between the factions was not. The power-minded monarchs and oligarchs of the feudal system sat on the right, with the liberty-minded classical liberals on the left. Plato on the right, Aristotle on the left, if you will. and that arrangement stood well into the mid-19th century. Now, as the 19th century came to a close, there was a major shift in political philosophy. That came with the rise of socialism. In 1848, Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto. In it, Marx would detail a supposedly new system aimed to fix the problems of the very thing that had freed people across the globe, capitalism. The term capitalism did not exist until Marx. It was simply known as the free market or voluntary exchange. This was unacceptable to Marx. He believed voluntary exchange was little more than exploitation and set out to fix the ills he saw in society. It seems he believed himself the philosopher King Plato dreamed of. His errors and the horrors it ushered in should be enough to dispel this myth. Rothbard sums up what the socialist aims and means were. Bear with me, but this is a long one, but I think it's quite thorough. Socialism began in the 1830s and expanded greatly after the 1880s. The peculiar thing about socialism was that it was a confused hybrid movement influenced by both the two great pre-existing polar ideologies, liberalism and conservatism. From the classical liberals, the socialists took a frank acceptance of industrialism and the Industrial Revolution, an early glorification of science and reason, and at least a rhetorical devotion to such classical liberal ideas as peace, individual freedom, and a rising standard of living. Indeed, the socialists, long before the much later corporatists, pioneered in co-opting of science, reason, and industrialism. And the socialists not only adopted the classical liberal adherence to democracy, but topped it by calling for an expanded democracy in which the people would run the economy and each other. On the other hand, from the conservatives, the socialists took a devotion to coercion and the status means for trying to achieve these liberal goals. Industrial harmony and growth were to be achieved by aggrandizing the state into an all-powerful institution, ruling the economy and the society in the name of science. A vanguard of technocrats was to assume all-powerful rule over everyone's person and property in the name of the people and of democracy. Not content with the liberal achievement of reason and freedom for scientific research, the socialist state would install rule by the scientists of everyone else. Not content with liberals setting the workers free to achieve undreamt prosperity, the socialist state would install rule by the workers of everyone else, or rather, rule by politicians, bureaucrats, and technocrats in their name. Not content with the liberal creed of equality of rights, of equality before the law, the socialist state would trample on such equality, on behalf of the monstrous impossible goal of equality, or uniformity of results, or rather, would erect a new privileged elite, a new class, in the name of bringing about such an impossible equality. Indeed, Marx had simply reworked mechanisms of feudalism to achieve, at least on its face, the goals of the classic liberals. This was enough to obscure the truth of Marx's ideas. Rothbard laments, to allow themselves to be outflanked, to allow the socialists to pose as the party of the left, was a bad strategic error, allowing the liberals to be put falsely into a confused middle-of-the-road position with socialism and conservatism as the polar opposites. Reed corroborates, but leftist was soon expropriated by the authoritarian Jacobins and came to have an opposite meaning. Leftist became descriptive of egalitarians and was associated with Marxian socialism, communism, socialism, Fabianism. The socialists were able to take up the left and push out the liberals. But what about the far-right menace? Why is it that a national socialist party that was in favor of social security, the abolition of labor profits, free education, and state control of the economy is considered right-wing? Simple. The Russian communists wanted the only claim to the left. Fried explains, anything not communist or socialist they decreed and propagandized as fascist. What actually is the difference between communism and fascism? Both are forms of statism, authoritarianism. The only difference between Stalin's communism and Mussolini's fascism is an insignificant detail in organizational structure. So we see the paradigm shift. The Marxists were successful in pushing the true left, the classic liberals, to the center. The Stalinists were able to smear anyone that wasn't them as right-wing. And there we have today's spectrum. A spectrum where the fascists and socialists are diametrically opposed, even though they operate in the same manner. Mussolini draws inspiration from socialists like Giovanni Giolitti, and yet we're meant to believe they're any different than Marx. All the while, the liberty-minded are pressed into the center. In either direction, authoritarianism rises, but we are meant to believe these ideas are any different. A spectrum flanked by these two ideologies is no different than a two-headed coin. They are the same on both sides. The correct distribution on the spectrum has always been liberty on one side and power on the other, since the days of Aristotle to the Russian Revolution to this day. We must stop persisting in feeding the lie that these two sides are any different. Now we can see the fallacy quickly in the horseshoe theory. There is no horseshoe. There never was. Both sides look the same because they are. You can see that clearly when you look at the simple distinction of authority versus liberty. Now you say, what about progressivism versus traditionalism? It is true that these things are diametrically opposed, and progressivism often goes along with the left, traditionalism with the right, but they do not describe any kind of political program. If one freely chooses to be progressive or traditional, the government may not even need to be involved. If these ideas are meant to be a vision for society, on the other hand, it will require authoritarian force to bring to fruition either of these cases. The spectrum must explain political means, not simply ends. But what of the popular conception of the political spectrum as 4 quadrants, the political compass? Well, unfortunately, it's a pipe dream. The concept of freedom without economic freedom is a farce. Sure, what you want to do is legal, but how can you do anything if you cannot afford it? The answer is you must ask permission from the government to get the money to do what you want. This is not freedom of any kind. This is nothing more than being a pet or a child, a dependent, Rothbard explains. Finally, however, the participatory communist world cannot be put into practice, for it is physically impossible for everyone to keep continual tabs on everyone else, and thereby to exercise its equal quotal share of partial ownership over every other man. A small footnote, Rothbard here does not mean slavery, but rather the creation of property comes from the labor that transforms it. Communal ownership of property then requires communal ownership of labor, and in turn, communal ownership of the self. In practice, then, the concept of universal and equal other ownership is utopian and impossible, and supervision and therefore control and ownership of others necessarily devolves upon a specialized group of people, who thereby become a ruling class. Hence, in practice, any attempt at communist rule will automatically become class rule. So in the attempt to communalize even economic means, property, industry, whatever it may be, you will inevitably have to create a bureaucracy and a ruling political class, and the jig is up. The same is true of economic freedom without any social freedom. All the money in the world means nothing without the ability to spend it on what you want. There's no freedom in this either. Both of these quadrants fall into authoritarianism eventually. They are an illusion meant to make government control more palatable by fooling people into believing they are free. They are not. There's no such thing as half free. We are the Republic's walls. Come and take it.